Hi YouTube, this is the Roman Atheist here, and this is End of Life Morality. So this is a video by a Catholic friar, monk, I don't know what his title is. He's a Franciscan of some kind, and he has a video on what he believes slash the Catholic Church believes is moral in end of life situations. So let's get into it.
One of the inevitable and often most tragic aspects of life is that it comes to an end.
Well, the end hasn't come fast enough for me.
Some are fortunate enough to go peacefully in their sleep without any trouble, but others present us with difficult, gut-wrenching ethical questions. How do we deal with someone who is dying and in tremendous pain? What do we do when the cost of healthcare is extremely high?
These are actually some very important questions that people should go over before they're in this situation with friends and family. I don't think religion should be a part of it, but these questions about what should you do when you're in near-death situations or you are dying and it's either painful or really expensive, I think those are conversations you should have with your doctor. That's one thing, but then also with your family, who are really going to have to live with it later. But let's let this guy continue.
At what point can we take someone off of life support? For Catholics, those who ardently support life from conception to natural death, these are all important questions with serious implications.
Like I said, this is very important, but I do think he's putting a lot of emphasis on the Catholic and pro-life stuff, which I find to be less important and not needed in these kind of conversations.
This is Catholicism in Focus. As in most issues of Catholic moral theology, the underlying principle for any question of medical ethics, whether it be regarding birth, medication, surgery, or in this case, end-of-life issues, is that life is a gift from God.
Alright, let's just say that life is a gift from God. It's not. There's no God. You guys all understand my position on this. I'm the Roman Atheist. That's a given. But let's say it is. Do you think God cares more about the quality of life or the time or quantity of one's life? I feel that the quality would be more important than the quantity. So once it gets to the point where life is too painful to be able to live on your own, I feel that, or my understanding is, and at least my hope for myself and what my family decides to do, is that end it when it no longer becomes feasible of having a healthy, painless life. Because after that point, it's not necessarily the best for one's ability to live fully. That being said, some people argue with me, and in this case, I fully accept that they have more than the right. And differing opinions on this is not only good, but it's expected, because this is a very topic that is very close to a lot of people's hearts. So let's let him continue.
While much of the world will suggest that our life is our own and that we can do anything we want with it, Catholics recognize that we are not the authors of our own being. Having been given life by God, we view it not so much as our own possession, but as something that has been entrusted to us for our care and protection. For this reason, the Ethical and Religious Directives for Catholic Healthcare Services, the official document of the USCCB, states that a person has a moral obligation to use ordinary or proportionate means of preserving his or her life.
First things first, that quote that he put in there, although is accurate to what the Catholic Church states, and at least my understanding, that really means nothing, because ordinary and proportionate, especially in this context, has not been defined when it comes to life. So you can decide what is ordinary and proportionate, and people will disagree with you. So that's something you can't really base when/how you want your life to end, or if you want your life to end in any meaningful way at a painful stage, this painful stage in your life, where some of this concept that religion should play a role in deciding what you should do with your medical abilities to achieve or do certain things. I don't think that that should play a role in anyone's decisions for medicine, as I've probably already laid out more than once in the past 5 minutes.
In other words, if someone is faced with a life-threatening situation and there is adequate health care available that would save their life, there is no question. They must receive treatment.
I kind of disagree. I think they must have access to that treatment. I think they must receive treatment is a bit of a, or they must be given the opportunity to have this treatment, but they must also have the ability to decide whether or not they want this treatment. Again, this is based on my life philosophy that someone should be able to decide when life should be continued or not. Though I do think there should be more than one step than just that one person making the decision. Maybe they should consult a mental health physician first, or in some way. But again, that's more policy. I think people should have the right to decide how they want their health to be done, and I don't think religion should play any role in that, is my stance on medical euthanasia in general, and religion's involvement in it.
Say, for example, you get stung by a bee, causing you to have an allergic reaction, making it impossible to breathe. Since EpiPens are easily accessible, relatively cheap, and almost always successful, you would not have an option of refusing treatment because you have a moral obligation to preserve your life.
Now that's more of a false equivalency to a close to end life and a more painful situation you're in. Allergies like peanut allergic reactions are life-threatening, but in the context that he has brought up, I believe he is more referring to more preventative, more damaging, and generally long-lasting things that just about anyone could face, where an allergy is for a select group. And again, I don't think it should be mandated that someone take any form of medicine they don't want to individually. That is not supportive anti-vaxxing, and I realized how my statements could pretty easily be confused with that. That's endangering your children, which is a separate and much worse issue, in my opinion. But again, religion shouldn't play a role in how you receive medicine and how you perceive medical information.
This principle also applies in the case of receiving food and water through artificial means. While some may not like the idea of being hooked up to many tubes, if refusing to accept such treatment would lead to death, they are morally obligated to accept it.
I know I think this is like the third or fourth time he said morality or moral or anything in this context where, again, religion shouldn't play a role in your actions when it comes to your health. But morality is a relatively subjective thing based on evolution and has no realistic bearings on the action one takes with their health. And again, what society deems to be immoral may not necessarily make it the incorrect or correct answer when it comes to health situations and dangerous health problems that some people face.
Failing to do so, or refusing any such ordinary treatment that would preserve one's life,
Something I must point out again, he has yet to define what is ordinary treatment. That feeding through a tube, which again, I'm actually in support of that kind of situation because it helps keep people alive when they want to be alive, which is a good thing, is important, and I agree with that. But some people could argue that the only ordinary treatment is being able to feed yourself, and I'm not saying that's correct either. I'm just saying in this context, ordinary treatment could be defined in wildly different ways and would directly contradicting each other and would contradict this person's statement. So you have to define what you mean by ordinary before you can make these kind of claims.
Is a form of euthanasia, as it is an action that directly causes the death of an individual.
Well, I don't think euthanasia is necessarily a bad thing. Generally, in the context of euthanasia, it's a willing decision, at least when it comes to a person's life, and willing decision by that person to end it, and at that point, I think it's okay. When it's the call of a doctor or a family member without any previous instruction by that person, then there's some more problems to that, but it really depends on circumstances.
While we often think of euthanasia, or doctor-assisted suicide, as an active process of giving someone an injection or pill that causes them death, refusing ordinary treatment has the same effect. It's not the disease or old age that causes their death, but our actions of withholding life. According to the directives, euthanasia is an action or omission that of itself or by intention causes death in order to alleviate suffering. Catholic healthcare institutions may never condone or participate in euthanasia or assisted suicide in any way. Simply put, we do not have the right to do anything that would serve as the direct cause of death.
Now we have reached the dangerous part of this video. When you make a bold assertion / demand that you can't give euthanasia and that it's bad by Catholic institutions, Catholic people, and Catholic hospitals. That is a form of control over what is thought and would be damaging. And again, the language that is used in that statement is relatively ambiguous and could mean a few different things other than the assisted suicide. But omission, you could define it in certain ways because there's always some kind of treatment you could give, and he goes into more depth about how that's not euthanasia, and I'll let him get to that.
This does not mean, however, that it is our responsibility to preserve life at all cost or by any means necessary. As Catholics, those who believe in the resurrection, we accept that death is a necessary and inevitable part of life, and so we are only obligated to use means that are, as the directive says, ordinary and proportionate. What does this mean? Directive 56 states, proportionate means are those that in the judgment of the patient offer a reasonable hope of benefit and do not entail an excessive burden or impose excessive expense on the family or the community.
Can I quickly point out that that statement means absolutely nothing and doesn't define what they believe it's trying to define just by the fact that it says like extra expense to the community, because you don't know what is too much an expense unless you directly define that at a certain amount or a percentage or some form in that way, where at that point it's so abstract that you really have no way of actually concluding where you are in any situation, whether or not it's euthanasia or not in this context.
The reason that one may ordinarily not refuse an EpiPen or artificial nutrition is because these treatments are easily accessible, relatively cheap, and cause little to no distress in the patient. But let's say there was a treatment that could possibly prolong the life of a patient that cost more than their house and would put their family into extreme debt. What if the treatment might preserve life, but also brings about extreme side effects that cause significant physical or psychological pain? Maybe the treatment is experimental without a well-founded hope of success. In such cases, the patient is not morally obligated to accept treatment, even if doing so will inevitably lead to their death.
Yes. Not morally. What is morally? Morally obligated or is not morally obligated. Again, as I have said like 100 times, that's an exaggeration. Don't directly quote me on that. Religion should not play a role in medical proceedings because it's based on information from thousands of years ago. Am I clear? Does that make sense? Do I need to expound? I guess say in the comments or whatever, and I'll try to explain why I think that in depth, but I think I've pointed that out clearly.
Because the means of preserving their life might actually cause more harm, and because natural death is not something to be feared, they are within their rights to opt out.
Could we get a definition on more harmful? Because that would be useful in the context that we are talking about so we can further this conversation. But my guess is you won't give one, or at least one that won't answer anything extra, because this is so I can't say that word. Ambiguous. There we go, I got it. I'm sorry, YouTube. I'm going to leave that in because I'm lazy. That we have no way of knowing what is actually a problem or not. So again, work on your definitions before you go out and do this kind of thing.
In fact, this directive is so important that it can even be applied to ordinary means of preserving life. If the burden of treatment outweighs the prospect of life, it may actually be the morally superior option to refuse treatment. Sometimes this may even give cause to remove feeding tubes. Medically assisted nutrition and hydration become morally optional when they cannot reasonably be expected to prolong life, or when they would be excessively burdensome for the patient or would cause significant physical discomfort, for example, resulting from complications in the use of the means employed.
Well, as we're 17 and a half minutes into this video, responding to like an 8-9 minute video, I think you get my point, but can you define those words so we understand what that statement means, please? That would make this so much easier, and I might actually be on your side depending on what the definition means.
If someone is in the final stage of dying from cancer, receiving food and water may do nothing more than cause pain while not offering a hope of prolonged life. Removing the feeding tube in a case like this may not be considered euthanasia, and once again, might even be the morally superior option.
Yes. When you have to have a statement that you make bold-faced claims but then say may and might, that diminish any credibility of what you're saying because you really don't know. For all you know, it could be considered euthanasia and it might not be morally correct because that you have no way of knowing because you're saying may or may not, or any other phrase in that kind of context that gives you some ambiguity on whether or not what you're saying. You're playing this very safe, Mr. Guy in the red brown dress cloak looking thing. I am very lost to where you're going with this because you're making no assertions, nothing that actually makes any claims, and it is kind of infuriating at this point, and none of this video really means anything.
The reason for this, which is an incredibly important distinction to make, has everything to do with the intention and effect of one's actions. By removing the feeding tube to alleviate pain, the patient may die sooner, but it is ultimately not the removing of the feeding tube that caused their death. They died because of the incurable disease. Continuing to use the feeding tube would not have any effect on preventing this, and since it caused pain, it became optional.
Well, here's a hypothetical. What if they starve to death before they die from the cancer? Would it then be the fact that you removed the feeding tubes that caused their death, and you'd have no direct way of knowing if you just committed euthanasia or not. I think these statements that you're making leave so much ambiguity in this context that you have no way of knowing if it's true, which, I mean, I guess is a fairly common religious thing to come up, but it's kind of to the point where all of these statements that you're making are bold-faced with no evidence, and even if there was direct evidence, it wouldn't mean anything because you're having all these may and mights and could not and have unprovable assertions, as I've pointed out a few times in this video. And we're 20 minutes in and I keep going in a circle.
The Catechism of the Catholic Church explains it as such. Discontinuing medical procedures that are burdensome, dangerous, extraordinary, or disproportionate to the expected outcome can be legitimate. It is the refusal of overzealous treatment. Here, one does not cause the will of death. One's inability to impede it is merely accepted.
I'll say it again. I'll say it 1,000 times. Could I get a definition, please? But I'll allow him to continue because this video is already getting too long.
It's this same logic, called the principle of double effect, that also makes palliative care, such as morphine drips, permissible, even when it might quicken the onset of death. Since the goal is to alleviate pain, not to cause death, the fact that a person may die sooner because of it is seen as an unintended consequence. For many in the world, and maybe even some in our church, these directives might be difficult to accept. On the one hand, how can we force suffering people who have no will to live to remain alive? We can certainly see why certain states have passed laws allowing euthanasia. And yet, on the other hand, how can we accept anything less than fighting for life at all costs morally permissible?
Well, again, with those statements you're making, both questions are extremely valid because you've taken no position, no side, no way of actively proving or showing why your statements are correct, which is one. B, then defining what your statements mean, so there's so much ambiguity, you have no direct understanding on what the goal is being asked. So that's another problem. There's so many major issues with this that you can't get any real information from it to the point of there's no use to looking into any of it.
If we are truly pro-life, we should never accept death until it occurs. What we see from the Church's moral imperatives, taken together, is an attempt to avoid two extreme and misguided approaches. One in which life is easily discarded without much care, and one in which we hopelessly cling to life by any means necessary. On the surface, they represent ideas that are diametrically opposed to one another, and yet, at their core, they share the same fatal flaw. They believe that life is something that we have a right to control.
Well, I mean, we do kind of have the right to control our body and our life and whatever we do with it. And I really feel that, again, religion should stay out of it. I'm going to let him finish his stuff up and then I'll give my closing statement.
What the Church speaks to so well and what should give our world hope in tragic situations is that God is always in control. What we have in life is a gift, and so it is our responsibility to protect it, but it is also our responsibility to let it go so that God may have it back.
Okay, so what have we learned today with this more than 23-minute video, especially when I'm done with my closing statements? A, it is important to define the words you say and what they mean when you make a bold-faced assertion, especially when it's okay and when it's not okay to do certain things when it comes to someone's life. We've also learned that I am against religion having anything to do with medical care. It should be a separate context, which is an important thing. It's also, in my opinion, very prudent that we continue to have these debates on what we find is acceptable. My personal view is when you think it's your time to go, you have the right to do it, but if it's going to be medical assisted suicide, I think you should have a conversation with a mental health person first for obvious reasons. But again, legally, I don't think we should stop, and definitely religion shouldn't have anything to do with it. So that's my position. I'm the Roman Atheist. Out.